There's a myth I hear about Russia all the time that is complete bunk. You've probably heard this myth too, and maybe you've even heard it recently. Because recently, a large newspaper that I will do the dignity of not naming in this video published an article espousing this exact myth. The myth goes a little bit like this. Ukraine cannot defeat Russia in a war of attrition because Russia bears the history of the Soviet Union. The idea is that because the Soviet Union was willing to bear so many losses in World War II to achieve its objectives, modern Russia would be both willing and able to do the same thing. And therefore, Ukraine stands no chance of actually defeating Russia because the Russian determination is just so strong, and they are willing to bear essentially unlimited losses. And if not unlimited losses, they're at least willing to bear as many losses as it will take to defeat Ukraine. The myth, as I've said, has made its circles, and a lot of people espouse it in famous newspapers and comments on my YouTube videos. But people don't realize that this myth is complete bunk for one simple but obvious reason. Russia is not the Soviet Union. It's much worse. One thing that people seem to forget is that Russia's current opponent, Ukraine, can lay claim to the same exact Soviet heritage that Russia does. Except it's not the same exact Soviet heritage. In many ways, it is a much more advantaged heritage, while Russia can lay claim to some of the worst parts of the Soviet legacy. And you might think that that's just propaganda, but wait till I explain throughout this video. For one, on a very basic level, when it comes to discussions about determination and willingness to fight for your country's cause at any cost, people attributing this to Russia and forgetting about Ukraine in that equation is simply dishonest. Because when we actually look at the Soviet Union during World War II, while Russia did bear a lot of casualties, the Ukrainians per capita bore far more casualties than Russia did. And they were engaged in some of the fiercest fighting of World War II, with much more of their territory actually occupied by the Nazis than Russia ever was. The Ukrainians, therefore, when it comes to the legacy of Soviet fighting in World War II, can lay claim to much more of that than Russia. So that's strike one for people claiming Ukraine's history as Russia's history, robbing Ukraine of its good things and attributing them to Russia instead. But for Russia, you'll see that this equation gets much, much worse. For one, let's talk about the issue at hand, and the idea that Russia is willing to bear as many casualties as it takes to win the war in Ukraine. Not only do people forget that that truth applies to Ukraine more than it actually applies to Russia, but they also neglect the simple fact that this occurred at a very different historical moment with very different underlying reasons. First of all, one of the reasons that the Soviet Union was able to force so many of their citizens to fight for their cause was essentially because the people within the Soviet Union didn't know anything else, because they lived in a period of time where they didn't really have the capability to understand anything else. World War II was, of course, a time of national propaganda, where there were new communication technologies that allowed you to communicate with people en masse. But these communication technologies were limited by limited infrastructure, allowing national governments to completely control the messages that reached the ears of the people. They could control the limited radio waves within their own countries. They could, to a large degree, control the printing presses that allowed certain messages to reach their people's eyes and ears. And because of this, we saw in every nation involved, in Germany, in Japan, in the United States to its own extent, and especially in the Soviet Union, an ability for governments to warp the minds of their people in a direction that was favorable to them. To the point that for Stalin, when he told the people of the Soviet Union that they needed to fight and die for him because this was an existential conflict, and the only thing that really mattered. A huge percentage of the Soviet people actually believed that, because that was the only thing they were ever told. And Stalin had something going for him here, in the sense that his message, to a certain extent, was actually true. The Soviet Union had legitimately been invaded by Nazi Germany. Nazi Germany really did want to take the land from the people of the Soviet Union to settle their own people in the living space of the Soviet Union. And of course, we know Nazi Germany was perfectly willing to eliminate people who were not German if it suited their own purposes best. So Stalin not only had total control over the messages that his people would hear, he actually had a degree of legitimacy in his fight as he tried to convince people to fight for him. And of course, it's not like everybody fought out of the goodness of their hearts. Most of them were conscripted and forced to fight. No matter how bad life was for the average Soviet soldier, even if they were not happy with their government putting them in this situation, the average Soviet soldier didn't know any better or any different. And there's a reason they put up with this torture from their own government rather than turning their backs and overthrowing their government. None of these underlying reasons, though, are true for Russia's war against Ukraine. For one thing, the former Soviet nation facing an actual existential threat is not Russia, but Ukraine, who Russia has invaded. And it's clear that the people of these respective nations actually know this, for reasons that I'll soon explain, and that has a lot of implications. Part of the reason that the people of each respective nation knows this is also because of another significant difference between World War II Soviet Union and modern-day Russia, which is access to information. Obviously, due to the internet, where literally anybody can publish content, and they are not limited by what radio towers and radio stations happen to be available within their country, there is now much more wide availability of competing opinions and competing facts to overwhelm the narratives that are being pushed out by despotic governments. And even though countries like Russia try to suppress this to the degree that they're able to do so, through state-sponsored media, through crackdowns on independent media and everything of the sort, it is still impossible for them to fully suppress freedom of information, and many Russian people privately know different narratives, even if they are not willing to, in public, talk about or admit to these things. And that creates a huge problem for Russia, where Vladimir Putin, no matter how much he tries, cannot control the thinking and the mental space of his people to nearly the same degree that someone like Stalin could. For this reason, we have already seen massive limitations on Russia's ability to push their people into war. One thing that is extremely significant and has been true throughout the entire war is that despite massive losses, Vladimir Putin has not yet been willing to subject his people to widespread conscription. And the reason he has not been willing to do this is obviously because he fears what this would do to national sentiment. If Vladimir Putin thought conscription would help him win the war without destroying national sentiment at home, it's very obvious that he would do this in a heartbeat. But instead, he has tried to use a different tactic to get soldiers into his fight that will still create people that are upset with him, but perhaps not as quickly and perhaps not as violently. This is the tactic of promoting inflation within the Russian economy so that they can fund extremely high salaries, where basically every Russian soldier functions as a mercenary. But even this has already hit its limits, with Vladimir Putin coming out just last week and saying to the Russian people that they were going to lower the Russian military budget next year because they understood that the inflation was starting to hurt people. And whether or not that is actually true, we still see Vladimir Putin feeling the necessity to tell that to his people. And what all of these things show us is that, unlike Joseph Stalin, Vladimir Putin very clearly has and feels a limit to how far he can push the Russian people. So they are never going to be able to get to the millions and millions and millions of deaths that we saw in World War II. People often say, falsely, that Vladimir Putin does not care what the Russian people think. But if that was true, then Vladimir Putin would not have state-sponsored propaganda. Vladimir Putin would not have laws restricting free speech and what people can say in public about the war. And Vladimir Putin would not give concessions to the people to try to appease them so that they didn't get too upset with him. A more accurate statement then would be, Vladimir Putin doesn't care about the Russian people, but he does care what they think. So even if he might be willing to push the people just as far or even further than Joseph Stalin, it's clear that he knows he's not able to do so. So for all of these reasons, we realize that Russia is not the Soviet Union. And when it comes to its ability to conduct and wage war, it's much worse. However, Russia was a part of the Soviet Union. And when it comes to making comparisons between Russia and the Soviet Union, there is a far more accurate analogy that we can use, which is pointing to how the Soviet Union collapsed during the 90s. And if you think I'm just picking and choosing and saying Russia doesn't get any of the positives of the Soviet Union, but only gets the negatives, well, there's something that you should know. The Soviet Union was not a monolithic country. In fact, it would be difficult to describe the Soviet Union as a nation. But in fact, the Soviet Union was a collection of different nations, some of which did more positive things and some of which did more negative things. And in particular, the makeup of the Soviet Union was one of an empire, and this is not controversial among anybody who lived in the former Soviet Union. With Russia being the imperialistic power that exerted force and control over the other independent Soviet socialist republics. Because of this, we see in Russia's history responsibility and heritage of a lot of the negative aspects of the Soviet Union that led to their downfall, while other countries, in particular, of significance today, Ukraine, were actually responsible for more positive aspects of the Soviet legacy, like technological development and the determination and will to fight that we've already discussed. And that also applies to other pieces of the Soviet Union as well. With that in mind, when we look at the Soviet Union and compare it to Russia, we can again say Russia is not the Soviet Union. It's much worse when it comes to what led to the downfall of the Soviet Union and why that applies even more to modern Russia today. There were, of course, many different multifaceted reasons for the Soviet Union's collapse. But when it comes to major primary reasons, people typically point to two major events. The first being the Soviet Union's war against Afghanistan, and the second being the collapse of the Soviet economy, which was due to collapsing oil revenues. In both of these cases, we realize that Russia is facing the same underlying factors by itself today, but without the support of the other Soviet satellite states to help prop it up and help it get through this catastrophe. Let's look first at Afghanistan. Obviously, this is similar to Russia's war against Ukraine, except for the fact that Russia's war against Ukraine is already many multitudes beyond this scale of what the Soviet war against Afghanistan was. It's many multitudes beyond this scale due to the fact of far more casualties, far more expenses, and far more losses from a geopolitical standpoint in Russia's standing in the international community, all of which are creating pressures on Russia that exceed the pressures that were placed on the Soviet Union due to their war against Afghanistan, which, by the way, they ultimately lost, even though the people of Afghanistan did not have a modern mechanized army like Ukraine does. Ukraine, of course, is a massive nation-state, big legacy of the Soviet Union, and the arsenal of the West at its disposal. And while the people of Afghanistan were also armed by the West as they fought against the Soviet Union, the crisis in Ukraine for Russia is many magnitudes of that scale. Then there's the economic collapse. And this one is really interesting, because in so many ways here, Russia is definitely not the Soviet Union. in the worst possible way. When it comes to the economic collapse of the Soviet Union, by far the major factor here was the drastic decrease in oil revenues that came about rather suddenly. The Soviet Union put itself in a precarious economic situation that is identical to what is happening to Russia today, where they became heavily dependent on the exports of oil and natural gas to support their economy. For a while, energy prices were really high, and this made the Soviet economy look extremely powerful. And for a time, some people even thought they were outperforming the capitalist people of the West. And they started to say that the Soviet experiment was superior to the capitalist experiment, and there was a whole lot of propaganda around that. However, it came to be that while when times were good, they were really good, when times were bad, they were also really bad. Because when oil revenues collapsed, the Soviet Union had no innovation, no strong technology to turn to in order to support their economy through that hard time. And so as oil revenues crashed due to declining oil prices, the Soviet economy couldn't bear that strain, and in particular, the Soviet government defaulted on its national debts. This became one of the factors that led to the collapse of the Soviet Union as it disintegrated into several different nations. Again, independent nations of people that had been dominated by Russia, by Moscow, that when they had the opportunity, chose freely to disassociate from that influence. Unfortunately for modern Russia, though, they really did not learn from this lesson. They, too, became highly dependent on oil revenues and gas revenues to run the modern Russian economy. And they actually thought that they had so much of the world's oil and natural gas that they could freely go to war with Ukraine, and that, for example, Europe would not intervene because Europe was so dependent on purchasing Russian natural gas. That is, of course, not what happened. Instead, most of the world sanctioned Russian energy, and Russia very quickly found itself not able to generate revenues. In this case, not because of a price crash, but because of a demand restriction with the same ultimate result. And you have to ask, if that type of economic situation collapsed the Soviet Union, why would modern Russia not be subject to the same economic forces? After all, when you look at the makeup of the Soviet Union, it was actually far more economically diversified than modern Russia is. As you've already said, the Soviet Union had access to all of these other nation-states and the products of all of their economies. And they, theoretically at least, could have used all of these to reduce the economic strain and get themselves through. But it didn't even work then, and Russia now has to do this on their own without access to those things. Even worse, when you look at Russia's modern energy production capabilities and compare them to the Soviet Union, those are actually worse too. So it's not just a problem on the demand side for modern Russia, but their supply side equation is a lot worse than the Soviet Union's was. When you look at a map of Russia and where all of their energy deposits are, you'll realize that they're in two major areas. Some are around the Caucasus, around the Caspian Sea, and others are way far out in Siberia, in the wilderness. The ones in the Caucasus are obviously the ideal fields, and that's a major problem for Russia for several reasons. First of all, when the Soviet Union disintegrated, a lot of the best fields were given over to different countries. Countries like Azerbaijan, for example, which now has oil revenue as a major factor in its economic success. Russia no longer has access to that, and the oil that they do have in the Caucasus is now running thin. That's a big problem, because compared to Siberia, this oil was easier to get out of the ground, higher quality, and closer to end markets, which made it much cheaper to produce overall, and much less risky to the forces of Siberian winters, for example. Russia now has to contend with this demand restriction at the same time that their supply costs are going way up due to these factors. And again, you have to ask, if these forces brought down the Soviet Union, why would they not bring down Russia? When Russia is not the Soviet Union, it's much worse. There is a reason Russia is invading Ukraine and is threatening the Baltics, and Ukraine is not invading Russia and the Baltics aren't threatening Russia. And that's because as Russia has grappled with the loss of the Soviet Union, it is realizing that it has lost access to a lot of the things that made it successful, which did not come from itself, but came from its dominance over these other countries. It's a sad legacy. It's a sad reality. And to an extent, you can understand why the average Russian person might feel this way. But they're pointing the blame in the wrong direction. They are blaming the former Soviet republics for disassociating from them, rather than blaming themselves for why those republics wanted to disassociate from them in the first place. But whatever the case, we see the writing on the wall, the math is clear. Russia is not the Soviet Union. It's much worse. That's why the war we're seeing in the world today is happening in the first place. And it's why Russia does not have unlimited advantages when it comes to winning that war. And it's why Russia cannot lay claim to Soviet history when it comes to trying to make itself look stronger than it really is. Russia is already trying to steal Ukraine's land. We sure as heck better not let them steal Ukraine's legacy as well. If you enjoyed today's episode, be sure to check out one of these videos on screen as well. And if you really enjoyed it, would you consider becoming a patron and supporting this channel? I don't put anything behind paywalls, but my patrons genuinely help me continue my research and continue producing these videos so that I can get this information out to more people. If you want to do that, just scan the QR code on screen or visit the link in the description of this video. In either case, I look forward to seeing you on the next one.